Most of us climb out of bed and immediately do things that are quietly working against our own bodies. We grab the phone before our eyes have even adjusted. We skip the first meal of the day entirely. We rush straight into emails and errands without giving our system a chance to actually come online. And there's one particular habit that longevity specialists keep coming back to that most people think sounds completely insane the first time they hear it. It involves deliberately making yourself cold. On purpose. First thing in the morning. It goes against every instinct we have about easing gently into the day. But stay with me, because I want to walk you through why this uncomfortable little ritual, along with 4 other habits backed by real physiological research, might be quietly adding years onto your life. My name is Dr. Wilson. I spent close to 12 years working emergency medicine, and in that time, I watched thousands of people arrive in crisis with conditions that, in many cases, have been building quietly for decades. That experience changed how I think about medicine entirely. I stopped being interested only in treating the emergency in front of me and became far more interested in the years of small decisions that led someone into that hospital bed in the first place. Everything I'm about to share comes from that shift in thinking and from digging through the research on what actually moves the needle on how long and how well we live. Before we get into the specifics, there's something you need to understand about why mornings matter so disproportionately. Your body runs on an internal timing system, a set of biological clocks that govern nearly everything. When hormones get released, when your cells repair themselves, when your energy production ramps up or down. These clocks didn't evolve in a vacuum. They evolved in sync with the rising and setting of the sun, with the natural rhythm of activity and rest that our ancestors lived by for hundreds of thousands of years. When your morning habits align with these internal rhythms, you're essentially cooperating with your own biology. When they don't, you're fighting against machinery that's been fine-tuned over an almost unimaginable stretch of evolutionary time. Every habit I'm going to describe works because it speaks the language your body already understands. Let's start with the one that makes people recoil: intentional exposure to cold. And I don't mean a shower that's merely a little less warm than usual. I'm talking about genuinely cold water somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius for a stretch of anywhere between 2 and 10 minutes. I remember thinking the first time I read about this that it sounded like nonsense, frankly. But the deeper I got into the physiology, the more it started to make sense. When your body hits cold water, it interprets that as a mild threat, and this is where a concept called hormesis comes into play. The idea that small, controlled doses of stress actually make biological systems more resilient over time. It's the same logic behind lifting weights. You create a small amount of manageable strain, and your body responds by building itself back stronger than before. Cold exposure kicks off a surge of noradrenaline, sometimes rising by 200 to 300% above baseline. That's not just a jolt of alertness, although you'll certainly feel that. Noradrenaline also plays a role in reducing systemic inflammation, and chronic low-grade inflammation happens to be one of the biggest engines behind age-related disease, heart disease, cognitive decline, metabolic disorders, and a long list of cancers. By repeatedly and deliberately exposing yourself to cold in a controlled way, you're essentially training your inflammatory response to behave more efficiently. There's something else that caught my attention while researching this: a family of proteins your body manufactures specifically in response to cold, known as cold shock proteins. One of them, RBM3, appears to have a protective effect on brain tissue and may help guard against the kind of cellular damage associated with neurodegeneration. Much of this evidence so far comes from animal studies, so I want to be careful not to overstate where the human research currently stands, but it's compelling enough that serious researchers at major universities are actively pursuing it. On top of that, cold exposure activates brown fat, a specialized type of fat tissue whose entire job is to burn energy in order to generate heat. People with more metabolically active brown fat tend to show better insulin sensitivity, healthier body composition, and stronger metabolic markers overall. All things tied closely to a longer health span, meaning the portion of your life where you're not just alive, but genuinely functional and well. You don't need to dive into ice baths on day one. Starting with just 30 seconds of cold water at the tail end of your regular shower and slowly building from there is a completely legitimate approach. And it's exactly how I started myself. Consistency matters far more than intensity here. The second habit ties directly back into that internal clock I mentioned. Within the first half hour to hour after waking, you want meaningful exposure to bright light, ideally from the sun itself. This isn't primarily about vitamin D, though that's a welcome side benefit. This is about calibrating your master circadian clock. Your eyes contain specialized cells that have nothing to do with actual vision. Their sole function is to detect ambient light levels and relay that information to a small structure in your brain that acts as your body's central timekeeper. When strong light, especially light with the blue wavelength quality found in natural daylight, hits those cells early in the day, it sends a powerful signal throughout your entire system announcing that the day has officially begun. This kicks off a chain reaction. Cortisol, a hormone that gets an unfairly bad reputation, is supposed to spike naturally in the morning. This is called the cortisol awakening response, and it's a completely healthy, necessary part of becoming alert. That morning spike also sets up the natural decline in cortisol that should happen later in the day. Skip the light exposure, and that rhythm gets thrown off. Cortisol stay elevated longer than it should, or peak at the wrong time entirely, and over months and years, that kind of dysregulation has been linked to more inflammation, worse metabolic function, and higher rates of mood disturbances. Morning light also governs your melatonin release later that night. Bright light early in the day tells your brain to suppress melatonin now and schedule its release roughly 12 to 14 hours later, which is essentially you programming tonight's sleep quality this very morning. And sleep quality happens to be one of the single strongest predictors of long-term health we have. Poor sleep is tied to nearly every major disease associated with aging: cardiovascular issues, cognitive decline, immune dysfunction, metabolic disorders. Your circadian clock also controls the activity of thousands of genes, including many responsible for DNA repair and cellular cleanup. When that clock runs on schedule, your cells are simply better at maintaining themselves and clearing out the damaged material that otherwise accumulates and drives disease. In practice, this just means stepping outside or sitting near a window within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. 5 to 10 minutes on a bright day, 20 to 30 on an overcast one. And if you live somewhere with long, dark winters, a proper light therapy lamp position near eye level can approximate the effect. Once you've handled the cold and the light, the next question becomes what you put into your body, and this is where the conversation gets surprisingly nuanced. There's a lot of noise out there. Some people swear by skipping breakfast entirely. Others insist it's non-negotiable. The research points towards something more specific than either camp. The timing and composition of protein matters enormously. Your body cycles between building tissue and breaking it down. Sleep is a naturally catabolic state. You go many hours without eating, and your body draws on some muscle tissue to keep blood sugar stable and supply amino acids for repair work overnight. What you do the moment you wake up determines which direction your body leans next. Consuming a solid dose of protein within a couple of hours of waking triggers muscle protein synthesis, and this matters more than people realize, especially as we age. We lose muscle mass steadily over time in a process called sarcopenia, and that decline speeds up significantly past the age of 30. By the time people reach their 70s and 80s, low muscle mass becomes one of the strongest predictors of frailty, disability, and even mortality. This isn't about looking a certain way. Muscle tissue is metabolically active. It's one of the primary places your body stores and processes glucose. So losing muscle directly undermines your metabolic health. Interestingly, studies comparing people who front-load their protein at breakfast versus those who eat the identical total amount but concentrated later in the day found that morning protein intake led to better preservation of muscle mass. It seems your muscles are simply more receptive to amino acids earlier in the day, likely another downstream effect of your circadian rhythm. A useful target is somewhere around 25 to 35 grams of quality protein. A few eggs alongside some yogurt, a protein shake, or even reheated leftovers if that's more your style. What matters most is total protein and adequate leucine content, since leucine is the primary trigger for building new muscle tissue. There's a secondary benefit here, too. Protein at breakfast keeps your blood sugar remarkably stable for hours afterward. Starting the day with refined carbohydrates, pastries, sugary cereal, plain toast with jam, tends to spike blood sugar and then crash it, creating an energy roller coaster that affects focus, mood, and hunger for the rest of the day. Repeated daily for years, that instability contributes meaningfully to insulin resistance. Protein, especially paired with some healthy fat, produces a far steadier glucose response, and it's also the most satiating macronutrient we know of, which naturally reduces how much you eat later without any conscious restriction, something that matters enormously for maintaining a healthy body weight as you age, since excess weight is linked to shortened lifespan and higher risk across nearly every chronic disease category. The fourth habit involves movement, though probably not the kind you're picturing. You don't need an intense workout the moment you're out of bed. For some people, that's actually counterproductive. What the evidence supports is simply getting your body moving enough to increase circulation and engage your muscles without piling on unnecessary stress. Overnight, you've been relatively motionless for hours. Blood flow to various tissues slows, your lymphatic system idles, and metabolic byproducts accumulate. Even a brisk 10 to 15-minute walk jolts these systems back into gear. Research on movement after meals shows clear improvements in blood sugar regulation, and morning movement specifically seems to extend those benefits. Better insulin sensitivity throughout the day, reduced strain on the pancreas, and a lower long-term risk of metabolic disease. The cardiovascular effects matter just as much. A moderate rise in heart rate improves blood flow to every organ, including the brain, and that increased cerebral circulation is associated with sharper cognitive function over time. People who move regularly tend to show lower rates of cognitive decline later in life. And while the full mechanism is still being worked out, improved blood flow is almost certainly part of the picture, since your brain depends entirely on a steady supply of oxygen and nutrients. There's also solid evidence that morning movement improves mood and lowers anxiety more effectively than the identical activity performed later in the day, likely tied once again to how your body expects activity to align with daylight hours. A simple 15-minute walk at a pace where conversation is possible but mildly effortful is enough. If you want to do more, resistance training or bodyweight exercises are excellent additions because they reinforce the muscle mass we discussed earlier. The fifth and final habit is the simplest of all, and it's about rehydration, though not quite in the way most people approach it. After roughly 8 hours without a single sip of water, you wake up in a mildly dehydrated state. Your blood is slightly more concentrated than it should be, meaning your heart works a little harder just to circulate it, and every cellular process in your body operates just a touch less efficiently than it could. Plain water helps, but adding a small amount of electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and magnesium, makes a meaningful difference. These minerals maintain the electrical charge across every cell membrane in your body, and that charge is essential for cells to function properly. A small pinch of quality salt, somewhere around 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon dissolved in a large glass of water, along with some potassium and magnesium if available, helps water actually move into your cells rather than simply passing through your system. That sodium also supports the cortisol awakening response we talked about earlier, since cortisol and the hormone aldosterone work together in regulating sodium balance. I know this runs counter to a lot of standard advice about cutting sodium, but that guidance is really aimed at people consuming excessive amounts of processed food, where sodium is high and potassium is low. The ratio between the two matters far more than the absolute number for most healthy people eating a reasonably whole food diet. And mild dehydration itself actually tends to raise blood pressure. So proper hydration with the right mineral balance can help normalize blood pressure rather than worsen it in most cases. Your brain, being roughly 3/4 water, is especially sensitive to this. Even a 1 to 2% drop in hydration measurably impairs concentration, increases fatigue, and weakens short-term memory. Long-term, Chronic mild dehydration also places ongoing strain on your kidneys and thickens your blood slightly, adding cumulative stress to your cardiovascular system over the years. In practice, this just means having a glass of water with a pinch of good salt before your coffee or your first meal, ideally with some potassium and magnesium worked in through food or a supplement. When you put all 5 of these together, what you end up with isn't a random checklist. It's a sequence that reinforces itself. The cold exposure kicks your stress-resilient systems into gear. The light exposure locks in your circadian rhythm, which in turn governs thousands of genes tied to repair and disease prevention. The protein preserves the muscle and metabolic health that so much of long-term vitality depends on. The movement keeps your cardiovascular and cognitive system sharp. And the hydration makes sure every cellular process underneath all of this runs the way it's supposed to. None of these habits will transform how you feel after a single morning. But stacked together, repeated day after day, month after month, they quietly shift your body's entire trajectory. You're not just adding time to your life. You're adding function, clarity, strength, and independence to the years you already have ahead of you. If you're looking to start somewhere, begin with a light exposure, since it's the easiest to build into a habit. Let that settle in for a couple of weeks, then layer in the protein breakfast, then the short morning walk, and when you're ready, work your way toward the cold exposure. Save the hydration piece for last, since it takes the least effort to lock in once the rest of the routine is already running. Build it one piece at a time, and what you'll end up with isn't just a morning routine. It's a foundation for actually living longer and living well while you do it.